I am here on South Washington Street, and we are looking at the Andrew Culp house. Now, the Andrew Culp house was built in the year 1832. It's one of the older stone houses in Gettysburg, and it has a very like resemblance to the General Lee's headquarters building. That is because it was built by the same man in the same time period. Now, this house sits here on South Washington Street, which was actually Washington Street in 1863. And during the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863, Major General John Fulton Reynolds and his staff rode right by this house on their horseback, heading toward the battle up at the Lutheran Seminary. Now, as the general and his staff rode by, women came out of the house and offered the troops water. Just about an hour later, the 11th Corps under Major General Otis Oliver Howard passed by the same house, and the women also came out and offered them and the troops water as well. Of course, this house was a witness to the retreat of the 11th and 1st Corps soldiers back through the town later in the evening of July 1st, 1863. The house sits here in an area at one time that was all open. Everything that you see around here was wide open. In fact, back here is right behind this building, and across the road is the Dobbin house and the National Cemetery. And I do have a photograph that I'll post later taken from the National Cemetery that shows both the Andrew Culp house and the Jacob Stockhouse, which is over here, as well as the Alexander Dobbin house. It may be the earliest photograph known of those three houses, and it was taken right around November of 1863, just about 6 months after the battle. Of course, the Culp family was a very large family here in Gettysburg and owned many different houses and properties. This house today is part of the Gettysburg WellSpan Hospital Internal Medicine. At one time it was a flower shop, and of course it was the Andrew Culp house during the Battle of Gettysburg. This has been the Andrew Culp house on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Culp House Part 2 here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And I am in the attic of the historic 1832 Andrew Culp house. There's the original floors there. Now today, as I said in Part 1, this is part of the Gettysburg WellSpan Hospital. This is part of the internal medicine building. And this is the attic of the Andrew Culp house. It has been drywalled, but the floors from the attic are still here. And this is the only part of the building that still has the original floors. When you go to the downstairs area, the floors were all redone. Take a walk down there. However, on the downstairs, there are parts of the original stone wall that you can see in some of the fireplaces that were in the house. And as usual, Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook is able to get you places that you normally wouldn't have a chance to go. Here's one of the fireplaces here. And there's the other one. And then here's the remnant of what was the back wall of the house. And of course, the Andrew Culp house was made into a WellSpan building, and it expands. There's an addition on the back. When you go in this office here, there's also a part of the original wall in this office. And ironically, this doctor that has this office also has therapeutic remedies of the late 19th century. So from the Civil War to the late 1800s, these were the types of remedies you got when you were sick or ill. So for a historic building like the Andrew Culp house, that's kind of significant and makes sense. Again, this has been the Andrew Culp house Part 2 on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Gettysburg Street, and we are looking at the Andrew Stockhouse. Now, the Andrew Stockhouse has a strange occurrence when it comes to the Civil War theory of Civil War buildings. As you can see, the house is actually made up of two houses. The blue side, which is located at 226, and just to the right of the door you see a Civil War July 1863 plaque, and then 228 also has a Civil War building plaque next to the door, July 1863. However, in 1863, the only part of the house that existed was the left side of the house. This house, the left side, was built between the year 1830 and 1840. The red part of the house was actually built in 1864 and erroneously displays a Civil War building plaque on it. But in 1864, or 1863 rather, during the Battle of Gettysburg in July, Federal soldiers from the 1st Corps retreating up the railroad cut passed right by this house on their way into the town and then south of the town to Cemetery Hill. This has been the Andrew Stockhouse here in our In-Town series on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. We are looking at the Andrew Woods house, which is located at 271 Baltimore Street here in Gettysburg. This house was built, or should I say the metal part of the house was built in 1834 by a man named Jacob Heck. 3 years later, tax records show that he built an addition, which is the brick section, and that would be the Civil War structure that was here during the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, during the Battle of Gettysburg, the house was owned by a man named Andrew Woods, who was a carriage trimmer, and he was a carriage dealer, and he had his 2-story brick house as well as the carriage shop over here during the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, many people say, what is a carriage shop? A carriage shop is where you would bring your carriage and have it trimmed out real good. That's what a carriage trimmer is. It would be like Pimp My Ride on MTV, where they get it all fancied out. Andrew Woods had his carriage shop in this building here during the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, the front section of the house, which faces Baltimore Street, was actually built in 1880. And it is a little bit misleading because the Civil War building plaque that is on this house is actually on the 1880 portion of the house, not on the 1834 or the 1837. You can see the Civil War building plaque here. But the original Civil War structure is up here, and it does have battle bullet damage on the 2nd floor, and I also took a photograph inside on a closet door where a bullet passed through the house. Now, during the battle, Union soldiers marched past this house on their way to Seminary Ridge and their battle line out on the Carlisle Road on the morning of July 1st, 1863. Later in the day, they were driven back past the house by Confederates who then occupied the town of Gettysburg. A rubble barricade was constructed just out here across Baltimore Street at Breckinridge Street by the Confederate Army, and both houses on either side were used as field hospitals. Now, again, the 2nd floor windows of the balconied house were used by Confederate sharpshooters to fire at Federal soldiers out on Baltimore Street in this direction. Some Northern soldier found the range back to the house and took a chunk of the brick out with a bullet right near the upstairs window, which you can see from the front of the house. Again, this has been the Andrew Woods house. Today, it is the site of Ghost of Gettysburg haunted and candlelight walking tours. This has been the Andrew Woods house on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. House that we're looking at, the brick gray aluminum painted house, is the Jacob Stockhouse. Now, the Jacob Stockhouse was built in the year 1859. So that means during the Battle of Gettysburg, this house was just a brand new 2-story brick house that sat here on what was then Washington Street. Today, its official address is 407 Washington Street. Now, during the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, the Jacob Stockhouse, which sat here on Washington Street, was a witness to the passing by of Major General John Fulton Reynolds, On his way to the Lutheran seminary, he passed right by this house, probably in the last moments that it would ever look normal again. Because just about an hour later, Otis Howard and the 11th Corps, some of the 11th Corps troops, would pass by the house. They would head to the seminary north and west of town where the battle would erupt. And just within a few hours, that battle would collapse, and those same troops would be retreating back through the town down Washington Street. Of course, John Reynolds was killed. He wouldn't be making that trip back. As the Union soldiers collapsed back through the town, they ended up on Cemetery Hill in the distance, where they made a stand. Confederates occupied the town of Gettysburg and used the Jacob Stockhouse as a sharpshooter's nest. There was a duel between the Union soldiers on Cemetery Hill and the Confederate soldiers here and throughout the town. This house today has battle damage almost on every side of the house, and it is the most scarred house in Gettysburg. One story is that an artillery shell entered the house near the window up there, and actually you can see where there's some brick that has been replaced, where it was displaced. An artillery shell, if you go up into the attic today, there is some boards that are missing where an artillery shell entered the house where a Confederate was up in the upper attic area. This has been the Jacob Stockhouse here at 407 South Washington Street on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. The Town Series on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook, and we're looking at the house here at 116 Carlisle Street, and this is the Joseph Weibel house. Now, Joseph Weibel was a local carriage maker, and he was also a realtor, and this is where he lived in 1863 during the Battle of Gettysburg. Much of North Carlisle Street, which you see in front of us, north of the railroad tracks over here, was developed and constructed after 1858, when the Gettysburg Railroad train station was built just over here in the distance, which is the yellow building that Abraham Lincoln arrived on. Now, at one time, a road, the Mummersburg Road, once went on an angle behind the Joseph Weibel house. Of course, after the train station was put up in 1858, then Carlisle Street here, north of those tracks, began to develop, and the Joseph Weibel house, being one of those houses, was built. This has been the Joseph Weibel house on our Town series here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Looking at this house in front of us, located at 110 Baltimore Street, and this is the David Kendall Hart house. It was built in the year of 1859, and it's one of a few structures during that time that was actually 3 stories tall. It was also unique because it used some of the bricks. The bricks that were used on this house actually came from the original Gettysburg courthouse. Now today, the Kendall Hart house sits directly across the street from the Gettysburg courthouse, which was built in 1859. However, previous to that, the Gettysburg courthouse sat right in the middle of the diamond where you see the flagpole today. When this courthouse was built in 1859, the bricks that were in the old courthouse were used to make several houses in the town. And actually, the David Kendall Hart house is the only house in town that had the bricks from the original courthouse that hasn't been painted over today. Now, David Kendall Hart was a shoemaker, and he was also the employer of the Gettysburg hero John Burns. He was also known because he responded negatively to Jubal Early's request for supplies on June the 26th, 1863, when he made a raid through town a few days before the Battle of Gettysburg, which you can go back and watch our video series, The Unknown Battle of Gettysburg, in 10 parts. Kendall Hart would also play an important role in the founding and development of the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Now, the house to the next to that house, which is 112 Baltimore Street, was the David and Fanny Bueller house, which was built in the year 1816. It's one of the older brick houses in town. Now, David Bueller was the postmaster of Gettysburg in 1863, and his wife, Fanny Bueller, wrote a very detailed account of the family's experiences and her personal experiences during the Battle of Gettysburg. Next to that, at 116 Baltimore Street, is the Mary Wasmos house. Now, the Mary Wasmos house is also a three-story house that was built in the year 1816. It's one of three houses that was built in 1816 with 3 stories. So this block of homes here, the David Kendall Hart house, the David and Fanny Bueller house, and the Mary Wasmos house, is a very historic block of houses here right across from the Gettysburg courthouse. And this is a part of our in-town series here as we look at different houses that were here during the battle that still stand today here. This has been the Kendall Hart Bueller and Wasmos house in their in-town series here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. West Middle Street. And we're looking at the George Corridori house. Now, George Corridori was born in the year of 1828. His brother, Nicholas Corridori, owned the Corridori farm along the Emmitsburg Road, which was basically a farm where they would raise and slaughter cattle to be brought into the town where they had a meat shop where they would sell their meats. Now, George was on his way home from Baltimore, where he had just delivered a carriage that his brother had made. Now, his son was in the Pennsylvania Volunteers, and George had been wearing a pair of his son's war trousers, his federal trousers. On July 1st of 1863, while coming up the Emmitsburg Road after delivering that carriage, he was captured by Confederate cavalry. They picked him up, and they actually sent him to prison. He was one of 7 civilians during the Battle of Gettysburg that was actually sent to prison. He was held for 1.5 years in prisons in both Richmond, Virginia, and Salisbury, North Carolina. The Confederacy began to collapse in 1865, and the prisons were ordered freed in February of 1865. Now, at the age of 59, and in prison for almost 2 years, his health began to fail, and it began to take its toll on George Corridori's body. In March of 1865, he was released, and he made his way back here to his home in Gettysburg. However, on March 23rd, 1865, he passed away from the disease and the illnesses that he contracted while in prison in Richmond and North Carolina. That very day, on March 23rd, 1865, legislation was passed in the state of Pennsylvania that ordered the release of all Pennsylvania citizens that were captured and held by the Confederate States of America. Unfortunately for George Corridori, it was too late. He's one of the only civilians captured during the Battle of Gettysburg that would die because of the illnesses, and one of the civilians that was held the longest. This has been the George Corridori house here in our in-town series here on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook.